Hello, everyone. It's Michael Shermer, and it's time for another episode of The Michael Shermer Show. This one brought to you by Wondrium. You know Wondrium, the old teaching company. Great Courses has expanded. They now have an online subscription service that gets you unlimited access to thousands of hours of their audio and video courses, documentaries, tutorials, and much, much more. I have a couple of my own courses on there, and I've listened to probably a couple hundred in the last 20 years I've been with this company. Here's one I just listened to called, I just started. As you can see, I just listened to the first two. Lectures, Secrets of the Occult. Ooh, right up my alley, but also just kind of generally interesting. Learn the secret, knock, and access the hidden mysteries of the occult, a world full of magic and mysteries that is much bigger than you might expect. So far, that is indeed the case, even though I know a lot about this. Like, what is the occult? What does that even mean, right? Alchemy, astrology, and divination. Talking with the dead. The occult ancient world. By the way, anybody can talk to the dead. Getting the dead to talk back, that's the hard part. Crimes in the occult. UFOs in the occult. Hitler Nazism in the occult. Yeah, Himmler was really into that stuff. The occult in the Soviet Union. Satanism in the occult. Probably going to cover the satanic panic of the 1980s. Along with other things, which is super interesting. Anyways, 24 lectures. Ooh, Aleister Crowley and his occult life. Oh, yeah. Very interesting connection there with also JPL NASA in Pasadena. Very interesting connection, and they'll probably cover that. Anyway, check it out. If you subscribe to Wondrium through my show, you get 2 years for the price of one. It's a subscription service that gives you access to all this content, including the course I just told you about. And you subscribe for the year, and you'll get a second year free. So drop what you're doing and go do that. Sign up. Wondrium.com/Shermer. WONDRIUM.com/SHERMER. Shermer. You already know that. Wondrium. WONDRIUM. Wondrium.com/Shermer. 2 years for the price of one. What are you waiting for? What a great deal. Check it out. All right, here we go. My guest today is Todd Kashdan, a professor of psychology at George Mason University and a leading authority on well-being, curiosity, courage, and resilience. He's published more than 220 scientific articles. His work has been cited more than 35,000 times, and he received the American Psychological Association's Award for Distinguished Scientific Early Career Contributions to Psychology. His books, Curious and The Upside of Your Dark Side, have been translated into more than 15 languages. His writing has appeared in the Harvard Business Review, National Geographic, and other publications, and his research is featured regularly in media outlets such as the New York Times, The Atlantic, and Time. He's a twin with twin daughters. How does that happen? Chance. Plus one more, and plans to rapidly populate the world with great conversationalists. Oh, good. I thought that said conservatives. No, anyway. Here's the new book. It's called The Art of Insubordination, How to Dissent and Defy Effectively. Todd, nice to see you. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, great to finally be in person.
Indeed. If I was your newspaper editor, I would tell you you buried the lead. So I finished your book this morning on my bike ride, and I'm listening to, and I finally get to the acknowledgments, which is usually just a list of all your friends and family members, and I don't often listen to that, but I had another mile to go, so I listened to it. And here's what you write. This is a deeply personal book. My twin brother and I grew up as part of the racial minority in a predominantly black neighborhood. Roxanne, the single mother who raised us, shouldered a large financial and social burden. I appreciated her then. Now that I'm a father, I appreciate her even more. Early on, I identified as a nonconformist and outlier, someone who was different. In my youth, without a father figure, I possessed few role models for being a man. I learned by observing and deconstructing in terms of how to play sports, how to ride a bike, how to be witty, how to attract friends and lovers, how to respond to verbal taunting and physical provocations. I learned through trial and error. Growing up, I had grade school teachers, neighbors, family, friends, and bosses who helped me rethink adversity. They helped me to identify how being an outsider builds fortitude, and then you offer your gratitude for all those people. Wow, okay, that's many of my regular listeners will know I'm interested in how lives turn out in my guests' personal lives. But yours is that's an eye opener. It's like, holy crap, dude, you should have started that with page one. That's big.
You should have been my editor. You've published more books than I have.
What's the story there?
It's
What happened to your dad?
well, it's an interesting phenomenon. I remember I was at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative with a bunch of scholars from different fields, and we were at a fireside at the end of the night, and everybody was talking about what it was like to be a racial minority at their university. And I was like, listen, I don't want to cause all this loathing to come in my direction, but I sort of had a code switch my entire childhood because I grew up in a neighborhood in Long Island where it was about 95% black. And so I always had to hide the fact that I liked heavy metal music and Iron Maiden and Metallica and pretend that I was interested in rap and Public Enemy at the time and, you know, and Blondie and all these things that didn't interest me and sports, the basketball that didn't interest me. And it was only at home that I could lay back and kind of let my own interests ride. And it was just for them, it was very interesting because they didn't think that term had any relevance in someone that was white, but really I mean, I know that you're an atheist. It's if you're an atheist that grows up in a religious community, if you're religious in an atheist community, who is the minority in terms of power, status, and numbers is not something that can be written in a single sentence. And I think that's one of many cultural problems that we're trying to reckon with right now, which doesn't answer your question at all.
What happened to your dad?
Well, my father walked out when my brother and I were 2, so obviously I have no memory of this. My mom had a mastectomy. My understanding of it, he's lost physical attraction to her. He put a little heavy emphasis on that, and then he ended up marrying that woman. And to some degree, my mom didn't feel good about herself, and so she didn't date, she didn't socialize that much. This is the 80s, so we came home, had our own key, let ourselves in, cooked ourselves meals, wait till she came home from her second job. And one thing that you learn when you have that kind of lifestyle raised by a single parent is you have to learn everything the hardest way possible, trial and error. So I didn't have someone help teach me how to ride a bike. When I was older, no one taught me how to change a flat on my car. And you learn really quickly how to develop a greater set of resources, not just from yourself, but collecting cool, interesting, highly skilled people in your social network.
Yeah, right, exactly. And who is this? Oh, and then your mom died, I trust, from cancer, from what you just described.
Yeah, so her father died when I was 11, and then she died when I was 12, and then my mother's mom raised myself, my twin brother, and we were an emotional mess. So I mean, really, this book is. I talk about her. I mean, she is my model, not just of a woman who grew up as one of the first women to work on Wall Street, but just like the strong, stoic personality who just had a sense of responsibility. Is if I don't raise these kids, who is? And there were a lot of people actually came out of the woodwork that wanted to raise us. I had aunts, I had uncles, I had cousins, and my grandmother made this decision unbeknownst to me, which was they don't need physical family, my twin brother and I, they need their friends because they're just about to transition into adolescence. And she made the right call. I mean, because those people I'm still friends with 30 years later. And it was really important that she realized that, your biological family does not necessarily share your interests and passions. But when you self-select your characters, that would have been more disruptive than anything else. And if there's a lesson for anyone listening to this to take away, it's take these decisions, these real central forks in the road seriously, and think of all the contingencies 5, 10, 15 years later, because I think that's what my grandmother did. It was a pretty wise move.
That's the Roxanne you refer to in that passage I read?
That's my mom.
Oh, Roxanne's your mom. Her mom is the one who took over after your mom died. Yeah, so this reminds me of Judith Rich Harris's book, The Nurture Assumption, in mid-90s that caused so much controversy. What do you mean parents don't matter? Of course, her point is genes matter more than we think. But her other point was that by the time you hit adolescence, your peer groups are becoming more influential than your parents. And maybe if your siblings are close in age and they're part of your peer group, something like that. So your point there with that anecdote is that at that moment, your peer groups were probably taking over the role of more influence than your parents would have in any case.
Yeah, it's this developmental lacuna, right? I mean, in some ways, is there's got to be some transition point where you move, where you specifically are just about to move from your core caregivers to your peers. And my grandmother anticipated that phase was coming. I'm glad you brought up Judith because, I mean, she is a principled rebel who basically, and still even to this day, people cannot stand the idea that the number of books on your shelf and the number of books hours you spend reading to your kids might not be as important as to where do you end up deciding to pitch your house or apartment and decide to raise your kids. And I mean, one environment 15 minutes away from another one could be the difference between do you become a surfer and develop this laid back attitude, or are you around high achieving kids that decide we're going to balance a scholar athlete lifestyle and be like really hard on fitness and really hard on developing our minds. And it's really important to kind of make those decisions might be equally important as genetics. That was an anathema.
Right. Neighborhoods, just the environment, the air quality, the food, the places you hang out at. The parents play a huge role there because they're making these decisions. Where should we move? Let's look at the map. Those are the kinds of things that I think people don't think of parenting until they become a parent to see what kind of influence that can have. I wonder if I might ask you to comment as a professional social scientist who researches these kinds of big topics, the role of fathers and families, the increase in fatherlessness in homes, that is, children being raised without a father. And of course, there's exceptions. You obviously turned out fine. My wife was raised by a single mom. Her dad walked out even earlier than yours and didn't want anything to do with it. And so her mom raised her. But her mom, she was raised in Cologne, Germany. So her mom sent her to this all-girls Catholic kind of Jesuit school, which the education is unbelievable. It's about the equivalent of a bachelor's degree in America for a high school degree. And then she was enrolled in ballet training, which is unbelievably rigorous, especially since it's German, right? So, she came out fine. So you can't just say, well, if you were raised by a single mom, you're not as well off as if you were raised in a two-parent nuclear family. You can't make those kind of observations. But could you say, on average, for 100 million people, 100 million children, on average, it's better to have two parents than one or something like that? What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so here my initial response is one of the problems in social psychology is we focus on two dimensions and how they interact, maybe three dimensions how they interact. I mean, just deconstruct everything we just said so far. So, what's the quality of your social relationships in terms of your peers? Are they where are they on intelligence, creativity, ambition, perseverance? So that's one dimension. One dimension is we were just talking about is it an opportunity rich or an opportunity poor neighborhood? And that's makes all the difference in the world for the vast numbers of people in society, not just in America. And then the third one is what's the quality of relationship to the single caregiver that you have. So if you have a secure relationship with one caregiver, there's a good question of is that worth more than an anxious or avoidant style with two caregivers? So, and these are questions that interaction between those three things. If you have two of those three, does that offset the idea of only having one parent in your life? And at this, I'm sort of a man of a certain age right now, where I'm starting to kind of be a little bit more skeptical. A lot of the science I've accumulated over the past 30 years, and one of them is we really need to think more multidimensionally about this. Now, we do know something which taps into, I think, the direction you're going, which is what is the deficit on average that we have for not having fathers? And one of the ones that pops out the most is dads that have daughters in particular. Their template for their romantic relationships or their romantic life or the romantic attachment style tends to be more dysfunctional if a father's not present. And one of the mechanisms is that fathers model well of how to approach people in a romantic style, and that children are paying more attention to is the father affectionate? Are they showing equal affection to other partners? That might not be actual partners, but other people to the same degree as their primary romantic partner. Are they treating them differently than friends? there's more observational awareness of what the father does than what the mother does. And I think probably, if I had to make one of many hypotheses, is you don't see as much of that in the media. So becomes more novel, more interesting. It grabs your attention. Whereas women as the femme fatale, women as the primary source of romantic attraction, that's every When Harry Met Sally storyline that we've seen over the course of our lifetime. But the dads, they're not really a main player. They're the bit character. They're not doing the housework. They're not that responsible. They're kind of lazy. And so there's more intrigue about paying attention to what's dad do? What does he think? What does he do? What motivates him? And it has a much bigger influence than mothers on the romantic lives of their kids, particularly for girls compared to boys.
Is this that meme? She has daddy issues. That is, women that grow up without a father. I don't know. They have more partners, or they're in more short-term relationships than long-term relationships. Something like that.
Always hated that phrase because it just seems like it's too simplistic. But I mean, it's out there. We should play with the terms that humans use. I think of it as more of there is a missed source of primary information of what is the way you communicate with your partner. How assertive do you be? When are you passive? When do you follow Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who said when she was asked, like, how did you have a happy relationship over the course of your lifetime? And she said selective deafness was the most important thing. I mean, so picking up those little details about when to solve problems, when to listen, when to be passive, when to speak your piece. There's something about the least accessible on average caregiver, by definition, gives more information because you're paying more attention to it. So it's really like there's a novelty element to this that might be as important as sex or gender.
Interesting, right? Again, on average, we have to look at these things like the number of books in a home is a proxy for various positive life outcomes, and the number of words spoken by the parents, the number of different words. That is, parents that have a bigger vocabulary and share that vocabulary with their children, that affects their education and so on. Again, this is one of these on average effects.
Yeah. Wait, so Michael, being that you are the master blaster of Skeptic magazine, when I think about these proxy variables, what's the proxy of critical thinking and healthy skepticism that you think in a household as you're being raised, as you're growing up?
Oh, interesting. Yes. Well, I have a 30-year-old daughter, and I now have a 6-year-old son. So I guess I'm running two different experiments here. With my daughter, it was never anything official. I never sat down and thought out, well, exactly how should I teach her critical thinking? It's just really by way of example, I guess, just conversations. I mean, I remember the day she figured out there is no Santa Claus. I mean, we never made a big deal about Santa Claus, although we said, yes, Santa's bringing presents, and that was big fun. And I wasn't one of these atheists. There's some in the atheist movement that says that's practically child abuse to teach your children that there's Santa Claus because, that's like a gateway drug to religion or something. And it's like, no, it's not. And she figured, we used to watch Bill Nye the Science Guy videos like all parents do. And Bill's a good friend, since that time. So it's kind of fun to get to know him and see his effect. Just walking through an airport with him is really quite the experience, because so many people have had that experience. But she figured out, because she'd seen something that Bill did on Flight, and that reindeer can't possibly fly, and the sleigh has no wings, and it's like, wait, this can't be true, right? So I think it's that kind of thing. And then she started going to some of our lectures at Caltech and meeting a lot of these people, scientists basically. And I think it gets absorbed through the skin, so to speak. It's in the environment without, no top down, like, okay, today I'm going to sit her down and talk to her about God or anything like that. That never happened. And, if she decided she believed in God, okay, well, whatever. And it's pretty much the same thing with my son. I mean, he's only 6, so it's too early for that anyway. But to me, I think that taps to what you were saying, right? It's just kind of, you are there in the house every day modeling something. And it doesn't have to be something formal where you have like, your 10 steps you're going to go through each week or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, because there's something that we know. Being in this field is having your alphabet soup after your name, master's degrees and PhDs and MDs, is not that highly correlated with critical thinking. It's not like motivated reasoning
No,
goes down and
no,
confirmation bias goes down. In
no,
fact,
no. The
if anything,
opposite.
the research from Yale shows, yeah, that the more intelligent you are, the more creative you are at creating these really persuasive narratives that your idea or your preferred outcome is extremely desirable. One of the cool studies that didn't make it into the book, this is the director's cut, was there was a study in the 70s about 500 mock jury trials. And what they found was there wasn't one single transcript entry where someone revealed information that was against their preferred outcome in the mock for the trial. So if there's guilty or innocence, death penalty or not, or prison sentence or not, not a single person on the jury provided any information, which is interesting because I think of all the conversations I have, how many people say, yeah, but from another standpoint, here's the reason why I would think that maybe it's not such a bad idea that, abortion laws are at the state level. I hear these phrases a lot in conversational parlance, but in the written word, blog posts, newspapers, television, you rarely ever hear anyone actually provide information for their non-preferred outcome in those settings. And I think it's something to put your finger on of maybe that little piece alone can serve as a nice intervention for reducing ideological conviction, political polarization. And there's some research by Richard Petty at Ohio State that supports this idea.
Yeah, that's right. Cass Sunstein did that famous experiment where, if you plant people in a room to talk about some particular subject, they kind of drift toward kind of uniformitarian position and become ever stronger. But if you plant somebody in the group who's intentionally going to challenge the status quo, that nudges everybody back toward the center. They qualify their conclusions with more, qualifying adjectives. Maybe, perhaps, it could be more Bayesian type in how they reason about that. Yeah, jury's trial. So, our legal system is adversarial for a reason, because almost always, the one side's going to be biased on purpose. That's how it's designed. If you hire an attorney, the idea like motivated reasoning, my attorney better be motivated reasoning. He better be, because that's what I'm paying him for, right? I want to get off. Chris Rock has this funny bit about, about one of his friends getting into trouble, and he said, "Well, you should hire Johnny Cochran to get you off." And he said, "Johnny Cochran? Oh my God, people will think I'm guilty." And he goes, "Yeah, but you get to go home." Right.
This is the most common phrase in Better Call Saul, that show that appeared after Breaking Bad, where a lot of people didn't want to hire him because they said, "I can't hire you because you're the guy people hire when people are actually guilty." Because he's so good, but it's like they know that he's going to kind of find every loophole possible. So there's this weird tension there's many weird tensions in the criminal justice system, but one of them is, as the lawyer, you want to be incredibly efficient at finding loopholes and problems and denigrate what the other lawyer is saying, but you can't come across as smarmy and you can't come across as this is transparent of what you're doing. So you have to have this subterfuge that it seems like you are evaluating the evidence objectively, but as you're saying, it is not just subjective, it is designed, it is a design paid conflict of interest built into the system.
But the jury, these are our peers. These are just randomly selected people that got the mailing and responded to it. I often think, what if we had professional jurors, that is, people trained in critical thinking? They've read your book or my books or Steve Pinker's rationality book, or they took a course in logic and reasoning, something, some training program. And this is what they do. They professionally evaluate arguments and evidence on each side and make their decision. I guess that would probably never happen. I'm guessing there'd be too much opportunity for corruption or getting to these people or bribing them or I don't know what. But, the jury of your peers, oh my gosh, sometimes when you see these people in the courtroom, I think, oh boy, I don't know.
But I love the idea of having the thought experiments of what are the social structures and norms that we can alter? I was just so Philip Dick, my favorite science fiction author. I mean, he's now known for Man in the High Castle because he had a nice popular show made after him. But he had a book in 1967 where it was a society where every political office was randomly picked from the populace, and the idea is that nobody has a conflict of interest because nobody has any idea, and you would save all of the money that would be used for political campaigning would be designated for funds for everyone that would did not make it in a political office that wanted to be in political office. And there's something to be said about this randomization for if you meet an initial qualification in terms of intelligence, motivation, and you know how to access information online and ask good questions of other people, then you go into the pool and then it's randomly selected. What you don't want is the person that is physically attractive, incredibly articulate, and incredibly assertive at grabbing their time at the podium in debates. None of those characteristics are predictive of being an exceptional leader. They just stage one, what makes you effective, might be inversely related to stage two when you actually have to lead people. But just the idea of principled dissent is even thinking about that possibility of should we make it more random opens up the ideas of maybe there's a better way for selecting people, maybe there's a better way for hiring people, and maybe there's a better way for doing college and university admissions.
Mm. Oh, right. There's another subject. Yeah, well, I suppose the pushback against what I said would be the lawyers can reject jurors based on their own history. So if it's a sex crime trial and one of the jurors had experienced a sexual crime, then you don't want that person on there. If you're the defense lawyer and you're defending your client against the charge of sexual assault or something like that. So I guess they do that sort of thing. I don't know. Interesting. I wanted to ask you back to something else you said. I was thinking about this Supreme Court Justice Jackson, the first African-American woman on the Supreme Court. And of course, conservatives, bleated out, well, this is affirmative action or whatever. I didn't really see it that way. It seems like, if you have a pool of equally qualified people and it does appear that having that kind of diversity does make a difference to a group, in this case, a group of 9, then why not? And then the secondary benefit is that, at least this is what we hear. So I wanted to ask you, is it true that, young African-American girls who see this, wow, look what she did. I could do that, or I could do the equivalent, or I can, like Nichelle Nichols died, last week. And, much talk about how this inspired a lot of women to go into engineering and communications and electronic, whatever, to STEM fields, right? Particularly African-American women.
Yeah.
And is that a real effect? I mean, it's one of those intuitions that seems like it's true, and it makes sense causally. I could see how that would happen in your mind. Is there research on that?
Yeah, so there's two parts to this, and I'm glad you brought this up. So one is with Jackson in the Supreme Court, and I was pretty public about this, is you could think of there's 3 important pillars for choosing someone in a leadership position. So you got trustworthiness, you have competence, and then you have to what degree people do or do not have a bias. Because it's really a matter of degree. And the problem that I had about the communication the problem should have been anticipated, which was the way that Biden communicated about this was he decided, I'm going to lean on bias and I'm not going to lean on competence. And I think this was a disadvantage for every African American person in society, is that he said ahead of time, I'm going to choose someone that's black and that's a woman, as opposed to leaning on only afterwards did people actually start to read all of the biographical information and say, well, this woman is incredible. I mean, in terms of Harvard Law, like on editorial review, and then the amount of cases that she was a public attorney and then private attorney far exceeds every other person before they made the Supreme Court. But why wouldn't you lean on the competence first? And then, I mean, to me, this is how you make this is to really think about if one of the goals was to get the best Supreme Court justice on this, into the unit. The other one was, can we move society to reduce a little bit of sexism and racism while we're doing this. And so, in thinking about persuasive dissent, the idea of being transparent that you are biased in your search, even if you find a competent person, is very hard to then reverse in the eyes of people that are detractors. But if you lean on the competence and that this person is absolutely amazing, I mean, how you can argue someone that makes it through Harvard Law, I'm not a lawyer, but I have enough lawyer friends to know is of all the grad schools, nothing induces more public speaking anxiety than law school, because you spend days where the entire spotlight is on you and all they're doing is asking you questions, grilling you, and they're training you to basically handle the spotlight well, because life and death literally might be on the balance there. And the fact that she's been in more cases is outstanding. Now, there is, from my understanding of the literature, it's pretty impressive that when you are a numerical minority in a group and you have role models that match you demographic wise, that it does lead to a sense of ambition and motivation and approach motivation, that you have an increased desire to make an impact, greater self-efficacy that you can make an impact. And so that's really important. And I'm glad you brought up Nichelle Nichols as an example. I mean, because here you have a really cool fictional science fiction show, but Martin Luther King, wrote her that letter when she was thinking about quitting Star Trek. And the letter said is that, listen, our whole family watches you week after week. Like, we need you because we need to have a future that we can imagine where there are black people at the helm on the most important spaceship that's traveling around the galaxy. You need to be there not for your own well-being, but for future generations. And when you get a letter like that from a Martin Luther King, she said that's what kept her to stay on the show, despite the fact she had some interpersonal conflicts, and she got, as you can imagine, more hate mail than we can possibly even sift through in our lifetime for her being on that show.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so would the conclusion of that also apply to, like, just how should I say it? Like, exposure to gays in the 90s on TV shows, for example, is often credited with, moving the needle a little bit in the direction of acceptance, because you just get used to seeing them and they become human rather than other. This is the argument. And then it becomes more normalized, and then at some point it just becomes whatever, I don't really care. And then, by that happened about 2011, same-sex marriage, and then 2015, the Supreme Court decision, and boom, we're done with that now. Fastest probably civil rights revolution ever. And so that seems like a related one, right? Just that is exposure to somebody, a black or a Jew or whatever, a woman in a position of power, just makes it okay, normalizes it.
I mean, as someone who has received money to try to reduce partisan bias in society, received like $1.5 million from a donor. We had at least 7 interventions, did nothing. One of the interventions that over the past 20 years has had 50 years has had the greatest effect is what's called the intercontact intergroup effect, which basically means is socializing with someone who's being othered. And so once you live on a block and you have July 4th or Cinco de Mayo, and you break tacos with them, or you're shooting fireworks and sit next to them saying that's freaking, what an amazing artistic display, your demographics are completely irrelevant. It's just 2 human beings experiencing awe, 2 human beings enjoying a culinary experience. So you're having these pleasurable moments that are shared, and when you have these shared novel experiences with other people, it increases the speed to which you have intimacy, you have commitment to the relationship, and you would protect them if they needed a defender. And for all of the really hard architectural attempt to try to force relationships between different groups, perhaps it's simply something as this, as watching soccer games together in Europe, and you're in the stands and you have the same shirt on, or going to a musical concert, an EDM concert, and everyone's jumping up in synchronicity. And there's something about the synchronicity where you turn to your left and right, and you don't see people that don't look at you. You see of everyone's waving their hands to the left and right, everyone's bouncing up and down, and we are like one unified body that happens there. And this research about the intergroup contact effect says that there is some lasting residuals of having these interactions, of having these experiences together that carry forward not just to the person that you were with, but you don't denigrate the group as much and you don't dehumanize the other group as much. And what I like, Michael, what you're saying is maybe some of the ways when we think about how to create a more utopian society, because that's what we're talking about, is start with the negatives. So start with, we dehumanize people. We have these prejudices and biases. So how can we start just to not eliminate them, because it's not going to happen. It's like a fool's errand. But how do we reduce those biases and make people more palatable that aren't like this? And if you start from the negative and actually start to kind of attenuate it a little bit, it becomes you start to notice that there are more alternatives that you consider that you might not have considered before.
Interesting. In your experiment research, what was the intervention, or what were some of the interventions you tried?
Well, one of the best ones we had was, one of the best interventions for any group, so organization, sports team, political parties, is to start futzing around with social norms. And one of the norms that really gets in the way from diversity of thought in a group is the belief that people are disagreeing with you more than they actually are. And so we collected data from representative samples in the United States of, we got blues, our Democrats, we got reds, our conservatives, and we actually asked them on a whole number of issues of, to what degree are you agreeing or disagreeing with people that hold divergent views from you on immigration, guns, abortion, universal health care, universal basic income, and pretty impressive numbers of about 20 to 30% gap between how much you think people would hate you if you held views that were different from the party, and how open-minded people actually are. So first we exposed them that people are more open-minded to dissent than you actually think. And then the second part of it was getting people to actually provide a resource to younger people than themselves of, hey, how can you be strong enough and courageous enough to actually disagree with your party on certain issues and still be a member of this group? So the idea was, this comes from Greg Walton, which was, as opposed to making people feel as if they are so partisan, they are so ideologically problematic that they need help, we are training them to help other people. And there's a therapeutic element of that, of making them not the victim or the person in need, but the provider of services. So the combination of shifting people's norms about how people feel about disagreement, and then writing a letter that's a resource of, knowing what you know now, how would you help someone that's younger than you that feels that their political party doesn't represent them? That combination moved people to be more curious about other people's views, more open-minded to divergence from the political issues that they stand for, and that sets up the opening to be persuadable. They might not change their views, but we can ask people to change their views on abortion and immigration. What we really want is, are you willing and able to listen to someone else and potentially open yourself to resources, information, and knowledge, so that maybe down the line you might reconsider how extreme you are in a position? And then, just as a final footnote on that, I often think one of the problems is we have this term of changing someone else's mind, and that often feels like, can I do a 180 on someone? Like, Michael, can I make you more of a theist and actually believe in one of the three big religions in an hour conversation? When in reality, changing someone's view could be, hey, you're maybe 5% more open to the idea that maybe there's, the universe is large and maybe there's a higher power. I'm not changing my category as, theist, atheist, or agnostic, but I'm like, hey, listen, you know what? I should be a little bit more open to it. And I think we have to be open to moving people 5% plus or minus in one direction, and not just the 180s.
Yeah, I think that's the most we can hope to do here. We're not an atheist magazine. Skeptic's a science magazine. We believe in things that are positive, not just things we don't believe. That is, we define ourselves by the things we believe, like reason and rationality and logic and critical thinking and so forth. And I think that's important. And, so if I'm dealing with a creationist, this is the example I always use, I don't, a Christian creationist, I don't give him a copy of Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion. I give him a copy of The Language of God by Francis Collins, because he's an articulate defender of evolutionary theory, and he's a born-again evangelical Christian, right? So it's like, that's a member of your team, and he says it's okay. Not only that it's okay, it's actually true, and you should believe what's true because that's what God wants for you, something like that. And then it's like, oh, okay, right? So I think that's what you're talking about, right?
Yeah. Wait, Michael, tell me if this was you, because I might be mistaken if thinking it was someone else, because I've been listening to you since I was in high school, so
No.
it's been a while. I think you once said that if we were to colonize another planet, should we or shouldn't we have a religion?
Right.
Yeah, and then you said that you actually believe that maybe Mormonism would be the religion if we were to colonize
Right.
another planet, because it would be such a heterogeneous bunch of people. What would
Right.
be a moral fiber that would bring them all together? But am I right? That was you?
Yeah, that was it. That's right. And in Mormonism, you get your own planet after you die anyway. So it's kind of built into the system. Okay, back to, yeah. So, again, I think the most we can hope for is just kind of put it out there. Here are the arguments. What about the climate deniers, the vaccine hesitant people? Okay, here you can put out the facts. Often these things don't turn on the facts, right? It turns on some other value that people hold. Most of us don't know much about climate science. I'm not a climate scientist. What do I know? And vaccines, yeah, okay, I listen to the CDC and then I read this person or that or whatever, but it's not what I do for a living. So in a way, when I signal, yeah, I accept the CDC's recommendations on the vaccines or the IPCC's consensus report about climate change, in a way, I'm saying, you know what, I pretty much trust science to most of the time get it right. I know that it's not perfect, but particularly if there's a consensus of a diverse set of scientists who don't know each other, they work in different fields. This person studies glaciers, this one studies clouds, this one studies the migratory patterns of birds and the flowering of plants that happens earlier and earlier because it's getting warmer earlier in the spring, and so on and so forth. And it's not like they're meeting on the weekends to get their story straight, right? They don't even know each other. They don't go to the same conferences. They get different grants and so on. And they're all coming to the same conclusion. So I can say, I'm reasonably confident. That's just not an argument from authority. I'm not saying I have faith in science. It's that it usually works most of the time. And if it turns out to be wrong, okay, well, then we'll change our mind. But, I think that's the most we can hope to do there.
Yeah, what's tough about that is there aren't that many Michael Shermers in 350 million people in America who you can recognize we're not one academic conference. There is this interdisciplinary, scaffolding of knowledge that's occurred. This happened with evolutionary theory, and now it's happening with climate change. There was some great work by Kurt Gray and his team at Chapel Hill where they showed of one of the ways to get people to move a little bit in the direction of being persuadable is not about the information and facts. It's about when the purveyor of knowledge is providing a story where they were personally harmed and how this issue affects them directly. That ends up being very persuasive. So when Chris Christie, the ex-governor of New Jersey, when he came out as a conservative and talked about being overweight, someone who's not physically fit in the slightest, and that COVID hit him hard, and he was describing the physical ailments that he had, and here are these risk factors, and the drugs, the drugs weren't able to help him right away, but listen, he recovered from it despite being pretty obese and pretty sedentary for his behavior. That influenced a lot of people because it was a personal story of harm. And there's something to be said about deconstructing the mistakes that scientists are making as all these issues are happening simultaneously. And the one that comes to mind to me all the time, and I don't know how much this stuck with you, is when the CDC came out and talked about, mask mandates and in terms of physical distancing, and then they gave a public display of a get out of jail free card for any racial reckoning, meetings happening in public, and and
the BLM movement
and protests, and that was to me it's not that I'm not criticizing the CDC and saying shame on you, Monty Python. I'm saying is that let's think about that to make sure we don't do that again. Is those are two completely independent issues, and the proper way to have handled it. Thinking about that, they're knowing from the Ebola virus and knowing from from polio, what in the polio vaccine, knowing that there were going to be deniers of the vaccine. The idea of putting out a public message with multiple scientists and epidemiologists to say it's not going to matter as much as focusing on racial progress right now. I think you should. That was, that mismessaging is when if monkeypox gets worse or whatever the next, airborne or chemical problem is, separate social issues from the nature of how physical pathogens actually operate in human bodies and plants and in our food supply.
Yeah, it's the hypocrisy that people really hate. You say one thing and then you do something else. The governor of my state, California here, Governor Newsom, famously went to that super expensive French restaurant for his fundraiser, with no masks and right in the middle of the whole thing, right after he held a press conference and said, here's what you have to do. Now, people just hate that. Same thing with Prime Minister Johnson. It's like he went to 19 different parties or something. Like, you just can't do that. I don't know what these guys are thinking. Like, I'm above this.
And it's really it's sticky too. Hypocrisy is sticky, and we have to understand that's part of human nature. We're all hypocrites. And so, one of the effective ways of communicating about a message where you're going to have detractors is providing a very carefully curated two-sided message where you provide the caveats that you think the audience is going to say when you get to Q&A after your talk. I mean, this is what the best public speakers do. Is I'm going to build in the arguments before you even have them, and they're going to be worded better than they're going to be by you, and then you can just refer back to, hey, remember when you were like disagreeing with yourself on stage? I just want to say I think that was the best part of your presentation. It doesn't have the same power as them at the end pointing out, you know what, you didn't mention all the side effects when you talked about the vaccine. And so we have to be really, really think carefully of human beings are biased, human beings are tribal, human beings they like certainty over uncertainty. And so if you can provide the caveats and the footnotes of where your view has boundary conditions, you actually give them certainty because you've provided clear indication of this is not 100% pure. I'm not 100% certain. But let's lean into this because you're not going to find a percentage as high quality and as impressive as what I'm describing here.
Skeptic, I published an excerpt from Stephen Bloom's new book called Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes. So he wrote a biography, essentially, or an account of Jane Elliott's famous experiments that she conducted the week after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated.
Yeah.
And, with no approval of anybody, there was no IRB, submission of, I'm thinking about doing this. She didn't even tell the parents or her fellow teachers. She just did it.
Great days to be a scientist.
Yeah, that's right. You don't have to worry about, getting approval for anything. Anyway, she turns out to be quite the firecracker and a little bit of a controversialist, a bit of a professional contrarian by temperament. And, she pissed off a lot of the fellow teachers and parents. Basically, she lied to these children by telling them, those of you that have blue eyes are inferior to those who have brown eyes. And then she reversed it and so on and separated them. The effects were quite dramatic and long lasting. But also, according to Stephen, the local townspeople were not too keen on being told, you're all a bunch of racists. Basically, this was in Ohio, but you're a bunch of redneck racists. And I'm here to tell you, you're the problem. They did not receive this very kindly at all because she got a massive amount of press. I mean, she was on The Tonight Show. She got flown to New York on The Tonight Show to talk about.
No kidding.
Carson? She was huge. Yeah. And then she went on Oprah like 5 times, right? And so basically she's saying, we're all racist, and particularly the people where I live. And, so you can imagine they weren't too keen on hearing this. But, the whole idea is interesting because I just wrote about this a little bit in my intro to our issue. How many Google programmers are there with blue eyes and brown eyes and hazel eyes? I have no idea. Who cares? I mean, it's irrelevant, right? Or how many congressmen have blue eyes or brown eyes? I don't know. How many CEOs of the Fortune 500? I don't know. I don't care. It shouldn't matter. And the question is, so here's my question for you, because no one has the answer anyway. How can we get to a world where that would also apply to skin color, your hair, facial features, the kinds of superficial features that are no different than brown eyes, blue eyes, where it doesn't matter. No one knows, no one cares. It's not part of the conversation. But in fact, racial issues are very much part of the conversation, pretty much daily, unlike blue eyes,
Yeah.
brown eyes.
Especially in our world of academia and just and authors. I mean, this is so I mean, this is radioactive territory that we're entering into here. So, like you said, there's no answer here. I think we can go back to something that we talked about earlier, which is these two-sided messages, which I think can be very helpful. Which is, can we be honest about what the data shows? And that includes people's qualitative data about people's experiences in terms of what's changed since the 1960s, 70s, and 80s to 2022, as we're talking right now. Where do we have undercorrections, particularly in the criminal justice system, where it's very clear that racial biases does not even begin to describe like where the problems lie in the system. And so, one of them is plea bargains. That's like one of having done research over the past year of where are the pivot points where there are the greatest and the least racial differences. One of those is the opportunity for a plea bargain where you're basically sitting in a room with two detectives and they're saying, listen, if you're wrong and end up being that you are guilty and you're not innocent, I just want you to know that you're going to experience 15, 20 years in jail. If you disagree with us right now, before we go to a trial, 1 year, you're in, you're out. So that is where there is the greatest racial bias, where people don't even get due process if you're non-white, compared to people that are white and Hispanic, especially Asian American. But there are other parts of the judicial system where you find much smaller to minuscule racial biases. And I think to broaden this out, I think it's really important, and I'm not seeing this in academia, and I'm not seeing this in the New York Times and legacy media, and I think this is important, is where are we making the undercorrections where there's real racial discrimination biases, particular when you get off the East Coast and West Coast, and then where are we making overcorrections where there aren't really racial biases. So in academia, and especially academic Twitter, if you are part of the LGBTQ community and you are non-white and you say there's a problem, you will get much more attention and much more resources than someone that looks like me and has my demographics to happen there. This is just factual. Now, this is not the case for every university in the country, but definitely when we're talking about...
Hang on one second.
Yeah.
Can you clarify on the plea bargaining thing? Are African Americans getting fewer plea bargains, or are the plea bargains worse? They get 5 years instead of 1 year if they plea bargain, or is it both?
Everything negative. So they are more likely to be given a plea bargain deal without their lawyers present, and then they're more likely to have a push to have a extra emphasis not to have an actual trial and actual have due process, but actually negotiate a lesser sentence as opposed to having actually your day in court. And then as you were saying, the third part of that is those deals tend to be worse in terms of the offering that you get is worse in terms of more severe punishments compared to whites and other races if you end up being African American. So it's really important to say, as opposed to saying just flatly, the criminal justice system is a form of white supremacy. There's nothing. It's too big to get your hands. There's so many parts to the system. It is better. And to answer your question of how do we start moving away from race being the fundamental variable when sometimes it is irrelevant to the situation, is being much more precise and clear in terms of here's where it's problematic, here is where it is abysmal, atrocious. Like it is It is unbelievable that we still have these problems in society. And here is, they're actually really, it's trivial, non-trivial to no differences here. When you do that two-sided message and you clarify where the problems are, where they aren't, where they're bigger, where they're smaller, you get more attraction to your cause. You get more people that are going to be allies for that cause. And then those problems are more likely to be solved. But when you say that, the entire educational system is racist, and when you say that, being African American in a university, you're at a disadvantage sometimes. But let's be precise exactly where that happens. If you're at the Princetons and the Yales and the Berkeleys, even if you're talking about like the Emory's, southeastern universities, if you are a student of color or faculty of color and there is a problem, there is no more powerful gesture that can be done right now than to say that someone is treating you in a racist manner. I mean, you will not get more attention for anything else that happens right now. But that's not representative of all adult workers. It's not representative of all schools. But with that clarity, all of a sudden you can get like, okay, like I want to know what happened at Emory, and I also want to know what happened at Idaho State, and I want to know what happened in the community college, in the Northwest region of Arizona, and then we can start to actually, resolve the problems as opposed to treat 2022 as if we're still living in 1971.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, here I was thinking of the concept of an operational definition that social scientists have to have. What exactly is it we're trying to measure? So here, what's the problem? The problem is that there are racial group differences in income, housing, healthcare, across the board, representative of in Congress, the number of programmers at Google that I mentioned, whatever. So, and someone like an Ibram X. Kendi just says, well, it's because of racism. And it's like, well, okay, but what's behind that? Nothing. It's just racism. And so then people like me read this and go, come on, that's not a social scientist argument. I mean, that's one hypothesis, like when Scientific American published this article about that mathematics has a misogynistic, racist problem. And why? Because there aren't as many women and minorities in positions of professorial jobs across the board in STEM, but especially in mathematics. Okay, it's possible that the people doing the hiring now are racist and misogynist, but I don't know. I've met hundreds, thousands of professors in STEM, and they are pretty much across the board liberal, progressive, open, tolerant, going out of their way to try to to make the world a better place, to bend the moral arc and so on, hire more people of color and women and so on. So to me, it's like maybe a systemic problem would be more accurate. That's called the pipeline problem, because there aren't as many women and minorities applying for the jobs. Why not? Because there aren't as many getting PhDs. Why not? Because there aren't as many in undergraduate. Why not? Because there aren't as many in high school. Why not? Because there aren't as many in middle school. And at some point, you kind of get back to these issues we were talking about earlier. Maybe it has to do with your parental home structure, or the crappy neighborhood you live in, or the public schools you go to that don't encourage women and minorities to go into STEM fields, or something like that. I could see would be a viable argument for systemic racism or systemic misogyny without indicting the people who are trying to do the right thing, but because of the pipeline problem. But even that, I find, I get pushback if I suggest that, like that's pushing it back. But it seems to me still it's kind of a systemic argument for systemic issues, separate from what we should do about it. That's why I open with, well, maybe broken homes is a problem, maybe poverty, maybe the kind of quality of the neighborhood that your home happens to be in. Does that encourage you and nudge you to go into STEM fields or not, and so forth. Anyway.
No. I mean, these are conversations that had to be had, and I think most people, well, I know it because, so I mean, I just wrote one of my newsletter issues is the self-help industry for Black folk, and it was a response to a woman, a psychologist who wrote an article which was saying that that Brene Brown is not for Black folk, just white folk. And I was writing a response of saying is one of the maxims of cultural psychology that we know is there's more heterogeneity within a group than between a group. And so then this led me down like a rabbit hole of looking at the research of, well, what are the racial differences that we know on personality, interests, values, strivings? And to my surprise, there's really nothing there. There's almost no racial differences in any of the motivational styles. So go to probably your friend Douglas Kenrick, where he talks about what are the 7 mental modules from evolution that kind of might be an evolutionary replacement to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So you have the motivation to make friendships, the motivation to avoid diseases, the motivation for self-esteem, the motivation for social belonging in a group, and you don't find racial differences in any of these things. There was one researcher in California. He had a nationally representative sample of the United States, and he asked the question of like, where are personality differences among the races? And he did, if I remember, it was close to 471 tests. So you're going to find something. There's a lot of outcome variables: assertiveness, sociability, self-esteem, extroversion, emotional stability, conscientiousness. Of these tests, 93% of them, no racial differences among them. So, and of the 7% where there were racial differences, gets even interesting. So, Michael, you'll appreciate this because you're as nerdy as me. Of the 7%, none of them, zero, none of the 7% where there were racial differences was where one group was above neutral and one group was below neutral. It was all amount of degree, not kind. So it wasn't as if, Latin American 18-year-olds were basically quarrelsome, and then African American 18-year-olds were agreeable and compassionate. It was just a matter of like the intensity level. And when you look at and also if you look at the variability, the bell curve, there's the same amount of breadth of these personality traits for all of these racial groups. And so when you look at this, when somebody says that Brene Brown is not for black people, it's basically, I mean, this is where soft bigotry comes in, is you are imposing that everyone thinks the same, does the same things, has the same motivations when they walk into a bookstore of what they would pick up. And I really think that there needs to be enough people in society to have pushback, not to say that there's no discrimination and racism, but to say this is an overcorrection. And if we let's take a look at this. And if you look on average, this is great. This is a great discovery, is that there's no magical personality profile of particular races. Like, wonderful, like in America. And if you look at the data in 1990, it looks the same as 2020. That happens there. And so this says is that we can move away from temperament and personality and say, okay, now let's look at life narratives. Let's look at opportunity rich and opportunity poor neighborhoods, and then we are going to find something because the science is there. But as we start to get more and more molecular of where their problems lie, where the problems aren't, and where we can target, then we can actually do something. And sometimes I worry that too many people identify so strongly with this issue that they don't know what they would be or do if this wasn't an issue. And for me, I want to create, like as you're describing, like this whole book that I wrote was 6 years of figuring out how do you create a more utopian society. And one of the mechanisms is you need a diverse set of viewpoints, even if they're wrong. They get people to start thinking, but are my arguments well constructed? Are the things that I'm investing money and time in, is that the best thing that I could be doing right now compared to things? And you make your stuff better, even if that stuff is horrible that people are saying. I'll give you like a really good example. I apologize for babbling, because this fits with the latest issue of Skeptic, where I was on a phone call with shareholders of the Green Bay Packers. So for those that don't know, that's a football team in the United States. And so it ends up being that anyone in the public in Wisconsin can buy into the Green Bay Packers, and they're a shareholder. And so this guy was speaking up and saying that he had a real problem. At a meeting of shareholders, he was saying, I had a real problem that the Green Bay Packers have a rainbow flag and are supporting the LGBTQ community. And he said this: I used to be part of that, and then I was with Reggie White, who is a Hall of Fame football player who's now retired. And he helped me pray away that lifestyle, and now I'm no longer part of that group.
Pray away the gay.
So in case it's not clear, I don't agree with anything this guy is saying. But I'm going to make an argument based on the science of 60 years of minority influence that it is good that he was at this meeting and it's good that he spoke. Because here I am having, one of many conversations. And in that meeting, it led to a conversation of, okay, maybe we shouldn't be anti-gay as a football team, but this does raise the question of how do we make decisions about what values and what social causes we support as an NFL football team, being that that's not what we really do for a living. Like, did we come to a good process for how we arrived at supporting gay rights and equality that happens there? Because the process is the precedent. And the precedent, while it might work in your favor this time, it might work against your favor next time. This is what the beauty of due process in the criminal justice system. So every organization should have someone that actually says something absolutely ridiculous and, in this case, homophobic, because it does help you elucidate, did we do this the right way? And what was our rationale? Was our rationale just because everyone else is doing it? Or do we believe in this? And if we believe in this, is the right thing just to do a flag? Or is that just, virtue signaling and just kind of, it's inconsequential? So this one person and their homophobic comments can set up a huge set of cascading conversations to improve not just actually how they actually help and support the gay community, but thinking really carefully of, like, what do we want to be as an organization? And I really wish upon that for every university and every organization and every team and every parent-teacher association everywhere is, if there's one message I want to come across, is you need these dissenting views because they will help your culture, even if it detracts from your mood and your well-being in the short term. And it's why FIRE is so freaking important in society right now.
Mm-hmm. Right, John Stuart Mill, he who knows only his own side of the argument doesn't even know that. So yeah, that's an interesting case study there. You'd think we'd rather this guy just keep his mouth shut. But in fact, he probably actually speaks for a lot of people who do keep their mouth shut. And maybe it's good we hear it and then counter it. And then the people that are quiet, your shy people in the previous example, can kind of quietly process, oh, maybe I should drop this kind of attitude about gays because it doesn't really hold water. And I think I'll just keep my mouth shut and change my mind. And we just don't hear from them, right? So maybe that's how much of this kind of moral progress is made, not by the extroverts, but quietly by people that hear the dissenting voices and so on. Yeah, so let's talk about your book. We've gone almost an hour and a half of it without directly mentioning your book, although much of what you've said comes directly from it. So having a dissenter in the group is clearly good, the diversity of groups. So here, again, let's emphasize, when we're talking about diversity, it's not necessarily racial diversity. That's maybe a proxy for something. You're looking for viewpoint diversity, as it's now called, right? And perhaps somebody who's African American and has a different cultural background can bring diversity of ideas. But I guess the concern is if you're just plunking down people based on their, color, skin color, whatever it feels, rather racist itself, right? Or affirmative action or something that doesn't feel right. But maybe that's a proxy for these ideas you're looking for.
Yeah, really, this book is about specifically for a form of persuasion called minority influence, where if you are lacking power, lacking status, do not have like a sufficient set of numbers where you are in the numerical majority, how are you can be persuasive to the group? And the thing is, you don't have to wait until you get power. And you gave a really good example earlier and talk of there is no social cause that people should be paying attention to more than the legalization of gay marriage is in such a short time period. And people have noticed 10 years is a very short time period, is one of the greatest social achievements that should be, there should be so many books written about how they did it, because modern day social activists can learn greatly of the way they did it is often a diametrically opposite of what gay rights activists today are doing. I mean, they were really big about having a sense of humor. They're really big about being very careful of who's going to be the person and why is that person going to be the spokesperson. And they're really good about talking to people individually, one-on-one, power players, to see if, without the spotlight and as you were saying, without the concern of them being a flip-flopper, can we get them to understand us and then come in together as a coalition and then speak up to larger groups of people? And that's why that is, I mean, that's why they were able to. The gay liberation rights movement was able to remove homosexuality from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It was once a psychiatric disorder, and the only way that they got it removed was following a series of strategies, playing a long game. Not going. There was no social media to say, listen, if you are teaching homosexuality as a disorder right now in 1971, you are an evil person. You are homophobic. You are transphobic. You should be removed as a professor, as a lecturer. That's not what they were doing then. They weren't trying to get people fired. They were saying, listen, our goal, they clarified their objectives one at a time. First things first. Being gay is not a disease. It's not a mental disorder. Let's remove it so nobody can point to this, this biblical manual and say, no, 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 it says right here. All the experts say you are a disease that happens there. And it was a smart move. So the question I would ask is, for climate activists today and trans rights activists today, and for everyone that hates capitalism and Wall Street and democracy today, is like, what is the specific objective that you want to get? And then, as you mentioned earlier, how can you measure that you're making progress towards that objective? So if you get to the Kendi approach and you were to ask the question of what evidence would show that your university is not racist, and maybe it's a few individuals, but the university and college itself is not racist, I haven't heard anyone clarify what the data would be allowable to say is that we are moving in the right direction. The trajectory is beautiful. Yes, it would be wonderful if we were at zero right now. Unfortunately, probably we'll never get at zero because there's always evil, annoying, obnoxious people. I mean, Marcus Aurelius, this is what he talked about, 1,500 years ago. So we're not going to get to zero. So what data would make you feel as if we can reduce the amount of effort there and put all that money and resources, as you were saying, into the pipeline, and then getting, where do we have needs? Do we need more black and women engineers? Do we need more black and women poets? Thinking more of where do we increase education and training, as opposed to maybe we are problem solving without an actual problem that's been clarified.
Mm-hmm. Right. The assumption that you have to have perfect representation of the percentage of the population in every profession. I don't think that's a good goal. I think the goal is just remove all the barriers so anybody in a particular group that wants to do that can do that, and that there's no barriers to them. That's all you want. I'm going to read to you the little section here from the Moral Arc on my chapter on gay rights. Here I'm quoting from Jonathan Rauch in his great book, Gay Marriage, Why It Is Good for Gays, Good for Straights, and Good for America. This is in the context of my arguing that ultimately, well, of course, you need laws and so on to protect rights, but you have to change people's minds. And this is what his goal has always been. So here's quoting from his book. Your guest, he said, meaning me, he's on a radio show, is the most dangerous man in America. Why? Because, said the caller, he sounds so reasonable. Close quote. In hindsight, this may be the greatest accomplishment I have ever been paid. Continuing here, I'm quoting Jonathan Rauch. It is certainly among the most sincere. Despite the caller's best efforts to shut out what I was saying, the debate he was hearing and the contrast between me and my adversary was working on him. I doubt he changed his mind that day, but I could tell he was thinking almost against his will. Hannah Arendt once wrote, "Truth carries within itself an element of coercion." The caller felt that he was in some way being forced to see merit in what I was saying. And then I continue from that. Once again, we see here a powerful restatement of the principle of interchangeable perspectives in which the use of reason in an open dialogue forces us to consider the merit of what the other person is saying. And if the other person makes sense, their superior ideas gradually chip away at our prejudices. Anyway, so yeah, I think in the long, I loved how you said it. And also using humor is good too. Oh, Rausch is great. His new book, The Constitution of Knowledge, is like at the top of my list.
Oh, yeah. No, I loved it.
Important books because he extrapolates it across the board: journalism, the legal system, science, and so on. How important that is.
What was the other book that I love was it Greg Lukianoff, Unlearning Liberty? Was that the name of the book before Coddling of the American Mind? That's an underrated classic.
Yeah. Have you followed much of the debate, by the way, speaking of Greg Lukianoff, of the effect of social media on teenagers, especially girls? Apparently there's this massive spike in depression, cutting, suicidal ideation, and so on in boys, but like 3 times as much as in girls. Is this, what's your thoughts on the research of that at the moment?
Yeah, there is a lot of controversy between camps in the scientific studies. So, I mean, I did a review of the literature where it's a little bit hyperbolic in terms of the increase in psychological symptoms and disorders in younger adults. There's actually a lot of really great studies that were done at university counseling centers with thousands of people showing that it's pretty much a flat high rate at the college level. And the reason is, so removing social media from the equation is just the transition from being a dependent to being pseudo quasi independent and living on a college campus is a challenging thing for a lot of kids. I mean, in terms of feeding themselves, friendships, romantic relationships, balancing everything, like just your scheduling. I mean, adulting might be hard, but if you're in your 20s and you really want to do in school and you have to pay for school, work, go to school, and develop friendships and have a social network, that's a challenging thing. So, also it's also the age where most anxiety and depressive disorders and psychotic disorders start at the mid to late 20s. And so it's age of onset just in terms of your genetics. So I'm not fully sold that pushing COVID aside, that we're actually seeing a mental health epidemic increase. I do think we have a mental health epidemic because if you go back even to the late 90s, you have about 40% of the population lifetime wise has a psychological disorder at some point while they're alive, and that's close to the majority, where it is abnormal very soon not to have a psychological disorder. In terms of the social media work, I think honestly the best thing that you can actually say is the results are unclear, because the studies with the best methodology in terms of time tracking of exactly what people do on their smartphones versus self-reports of what did you do retrospectively during the day on your smartphone. So when you collect real-time data of how many times you're unlocking the screen and then what's it doing to your inner psychology, those data tend to show on average almost a null effect. When you get to self-reporting, that's saying, hey, today, how much were you using your smartphone? How much were you on Instagram? How many social comparisons were you making? And then correlating that with anxiety, depression, and eating disorders. Then that's when you find the positive correlations of saying these seem to be somewhat linked together. So,
so it's not.
I'm not sure what to make of this.
Sorry, it's not just screen time across the board. So you tell parents you can allow your kid 45 minutes a day or 2 hours a day. That's not the relevant factor. It's exactly what they're doing for that period of time.
Well, here's the other thing. So this gets to more aspirational of what research I'd like to see, and this is partly me search because this is what I see my kids doing. My kids are very creative, so they design and edit videos, and they take photographs, and they kind of put them to mixes of they're forced to listen to 90s hard rock music because they're in my household, so they're getting Pearl Jam and Nirvana and Mudhoney and Rage Against the Machine, and for me, for my my birthday or the start of the semester, they'll make me these gifts where I say I don't want you to buy anything. They make me these videos, and they spend hours and hours. So here's my question to researchers and to parents everywhere: is it better for them to go back to having 128 crayons and then physically coloring in statically in a coloring book? That's good. Oh, boring as shit. Or have this very dynamic creative process where you can go on YouTube and learn how to edit videos, take that information back, go into this application, and you're basically like, a tiny Steven Spielberg and Pixar Studios in your household. That's a lot of screen time hours. Do we dissuade them from the dynamic approach to go to the static approach? So that research hasn't been conducted yet in terms of creativity being expressed through these dynamic platforms. What I would say as a question is, does your kid have sufficient friendships and sufficient social skills? If so, maybe you can pass and not worry so much about screen time. Going back to Judith's research about the nurture assumption, knowing their genetics, to me, the thing you should be looking out for is what is the quality and richness of their social life, the quality and richness of exploring nature, trying foods, going out and trying new sports and new activities. And if those are met, to me, I don't see that much of a problem in terms of them actually having some downtime and being on a device as opposed to coloring in a highlights magazine or in a coloring book.
Now you're dating yourself. Pre-internet.
Yeah.
I mean, the internet is so rich. It's so much fun. I can just waste away hours reading endless articles that I wouldn't be aware of if I wasn't on Twitter. Most of the people I follow on Twitter post articles that they're interested in, and they're people like me, so I'm interested in them. And I just find it so rich compared to, say, 25 years ago when I had to go to the library, God forbid, or try to figure out some source or whatever. It's just so much richer and interesting. I don't like the idea of breaking up the tech companies or heavily regulating. So I'm glad to hear that more research is needed. Clearly, there's something going on, some issues we have to address, but let's specifically target them. Okay, let me hit a couple more points on your book before we run out of time here. So you're arguing the case for insubordination, right? It's good to have a rebel in the group. When is that not always good? Okay, so you talk about this, what's it called? Default to truth. What's the theory? Fault de-truth or...
Are we talking about system justification theory by John Jost?
No. This is, I forget the guy's name now, but that when we encounter information or people, we default to trusting them or accepting what they say is true. Maybe I'm mixing this up with somebody.
This is Talking to Strangers with Malcolm Gladwell.
Yes.
This was a researcher in Alabama.
Or am I reading too many books and I'm mixing up authors?
No, it's good. I mean, that's why you're able to publish so much, is you mix this up and you make your own Michael Shermer smoothies, intellectual smoothies. I mean, well, but we do have a new model of trust that we talk about.
Yeah, because...
Oh, yeah. Okay. No, we have... Oh, go ahead.
Let me just riff on this for a second. So here's my thoughts on this, because it gets to what I do. To what extent are people rational most of the time? And, publishing Skeptic magazine or whatever, what we do is good because they can absorb the information and reason and there's hope. Or to what extent are we just pretty much hopelessly gullible? So here I'll pin two names on it, that Danny Kahneman thinks, we're just hopelessly subject to these cognitive biases and you can trick people into making the dumbest decisions. Versus Gert Gingerenzer, who says in his research, no, if you restructure these problems that Kahneman and Tversky gave to these subjects back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, if you refigure them in a way that is more ecologically rational for an evolved social primate species like ours, people are actually pretty good at solving these kind of logic puzzles, like the famous Wasson test where you have to turn over two playing cards to figure out whether, I forget what it is, a vowel or something on the back versus a number. Whereas if you're a bartender and you have to card somebody, who are you going to card? The person drinking the Coca-Cola or the person that's obviously under 18 or whatever? And the people do better when it's more of a social environment where they're thinking like logically about other people rather than some abstract logic. problem. And yeah, so Gladwell made this argument about, that, but the way he presented it, it made it sound like we're kind of foolish to believe what other people say. But in fact, the way I think about it is that most people don't lie in some huge way, such that you have to fact check everything they say. So my favorite example of this recently is because I'm a cyclist and I'm on Strava, and I post all my rides, and people check each other's rides and so on. Anyway, this long story short, there was this massive, like 20,000 word article written about this guy who turned out to be a complete fabulist. I mean, he made up all sorts of things about being in the special forces, and he was a CEO of major corporations, and pretty much you name it, he did it, right? But he got busted finally after like 20 years of being an imposter, because he posted a ride on Strava in which he could not possibly have climbed this hill at like 21 miles an hour. Like the top Tour de France pro could not have done it as fast as this guy, who's now like 45 years old, did it, right? So he got busted, and then that led this guy to look up some other things, and pretty soon he's fact-checking everything he said, and the whole thing unravels. But for the most part, if somebody tells me they were in the special forces, I don't have time to fact-check that. How do I know? And most people are not going to make up a story like that, right? So doesn't it pay to kind of be trustworthy of other people in social groups? Do what the group says. Do what your parents tell you, because most of the time that's pretty good advice.
Yeah, I mean that's Malcolm Gladwell's argument is from an evolutionary standpoint, you are in a better position to lean probabilistically that people are going to be trustworthy and generous. So you in turn will be kind, compassionate, and friendly with them, and they have access to your resources, and you have access to their resources. And the reason that these stories, I mean, that you're describing this biker, oh my God, 21 miles per hour going up a large hill is just, yeah. I mean, even I as a non-biker knows that's like absurd. The reason those stories are so attractive about these con artists is because they're rare. I mean, it wouldn't be interesting if it occurred on a regular basis. It's why Dietrich Stapel, was that his name? The from the Netherlands, the researcher who basically fabricated all of this research, and he was in psych science and published, and then there was the guy at Cornell University who faked the studies where if you have a smaller plate, you'll actually consume less food and actually be healthier. That if you have a larger plate, it makes you consume more. Got all these awards, worked for NIH, and ended up he made up all the data. And I have that story, in the book about, my mentor who actually falsified his data. So our default is that we trust people first, and then we kind of are able to expose who we are as a person, and then we can form these alliances quickly. But when you're in the minority, you don't necessarily have that advantage because you have a natural, healthy, subclinical level of paranoia, because it's not, the paranoia has like its basis in reality, which is that when you raise your hand and you are the only black woman in a room full of people and they're all looking like me and you, that more people are going to show skepticism, and more people are going to, fold their arms, and more people are more likely to look at their smartphone compared to someone that looks like them demographic wise. It's why the science is so great to show that when two women join an organization or a team, just that one person of them having an ally changes the cultural dynamics such that it's no longer acceptable and normative that you would treat them because now there's a little coalition there. So it's really important when you're thinking about designing teams of making sure, who am I leaving out as a minority of one where they're left to their own devices because you are probably not optimizing their human potential. And so one approach is to find another person in that category, which is kind of the leaning where society is going, which is a step forward. But a better approach is more psychological, and this was just published by, I think it was Bain is the first author in the Academy of Management, which was how can you amplify other people's voices and make that a cultural norm, is that you get rewards from the group by finding other people who have good ideas and shining a spotlight on their ideas. And what their research found was, if someone who is socially attractive, so you don't have to be the CEO or the leader of the organization, it's just the person that people like to be around or the person that people want to win their affection. the funny, cool, attractive one, whatever those qualities are. If I turn to someone who's an intern and say, listen, I just want to point out this. We talked about like we have too many meetings. Stacy had this great idea that we would have meetings on physio balls, and so at some point, not everyone has a good core. That people will be falling off the ball, and that would be a reminder of, you know what, we've been in this room for too long. So I think we should at least consider Stacy's idea. So here's the cool thing about this science. When I do that, obviously I showcase Stacy is a purveyor of interesting, potentially valuable, creative contributions. So that's one benefit. The second benefit is selfish. I look freaking cool. The group thinks I'm awesome because I'm able to spot talent. So who cares about altruism? Like selfishly, like this benefits me as well. And then the group benefits because we have basically extracted unique knowledge and ideas that was once quiet and suppressed and concealed, and is now public for the group to enjoy and leverage. That happens there. 3 benefits from one psychological behavior of just physically looking in the direction of someone that is a minority, however you want to define that in the room, and then verbalizing why that person has good ideas.
Yeah, then I was thinking of James Surowiecki's book on the wisdom of the crowds. He had some, that's about 20 years old now, but he had that research on how, like on the game show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, poll the audience. That works for really simple questions like, who was the actor in The Godfather, whatever. They're likely to know. But if it's a technical problem, you need a smaller group with a few dissenting voices, so you have some more rigorous debate to get to the answer. Those are much harder. So how do you know what kind of insubordinate rebel you want on your team? Because when I was reading your book, I was thinking of the survivorship bias. Like, how do you know that the particular story you're presenting, like you open with Charles Darwin. Okay, well, he turned out to be right, so good story, right? But of course, there's all the other people that came before him or were his contemporaries who also attempted to construct theories of evolution who failed. And so, we don't hear about them, right? He survived, they didn't. Like you mentioned, the Vestiges of Creation, and, that was published in 1844, and you talked a little bit about Darwin's background. Well, one of the reasons he was hesitant to publish, it wasn't just, he was worried about his wife's religiosity or any of that, is that after Chambers' Vestiges of Creation came out, he was pretty much pilloried by the scientific community because not that he had a theory of evolution, is that he didn't support it. He didn't provide a mechanism, excuse me, of what could be driving this. So Darwin's elder mentor said, hey, look, don't do this. You should pile up a lot of research and evidence. So he wrote those 4 volumes on barnacles and so on. And he did all that kind of legwork research and then kind of got his hand forced by Wallace. But there's a reason, by the way, I called my book In Darwin's Shadow, because even Wallace himself said, you know what, Darwin pretty much put it all together. I don't really need to write the big book. And he finally wrote a big book about evolutionary theory, and he called it Darwinism, right? So it's like Darwin got there first. He did it right, and everybody else just didn't quite have it. So, of course, we elevate him, or the example I use is Steve Jobs. After Jobs died and Walter Isaacson's biography came out, everybody read it. And it's a great book, and it's an interesting story. But I know people were scouring through there going, okay, what are the characteristics that made him so successful? Okay, you got to be an asshole, right? Treat your employees like shit. Go to a liberal arts college and drop out. Move into your parents' bedroom, and then open a company in your parents' garage. That's the model. It's like, okay, how many companies did that in the 70s? And we have no idea because they all went out of business, right?
Oh my God. I'm so glad you're bringing this up. So, I got this crappy book from a used bookstore, The Science of Good and Evil. So you have a good section where you talk about Alfred Russel Wallace. And there's see if I remember correctly, is one of the things that you talk about was, besides the malaria that almost killed Alfred Russel Wallace, as in like New Zealand or New Guinea, wherever he was he also believed that evolution was irrelevant to human beings and human thought, and so he had his boundary conditions were this So Darwin doesn't mention humans on the origin of species, and Alfred Russel Wallace goes one step further and basically says, listen, this everything that I'm talking about is not relevant to humans. So let's pivot on Alfred Russel Wallace. By him saying that, it opens. There's so much conviction in that statement. Even though he's wrong, he opens up the conversation of like, huh, but how are you so sure about that? And so this would open up a portal, because during that time period, I mean, in the UK, I mean, the amount of science, I mean, it was elevated to the level of, celebrities in athletic sports in America today. Like, people love scientists back then. And so Alfred Wallace he opened up basically a turbine of thought of, is this or isn't this relevant to human, versus Russell Wallace already solved this equation that it's not relevant to humans, so we're done, we're good. Like, and also the other thing that you mentioned, if I remember correctly in the book, was Alfred Russel Wallace opened up the idea of like, maybe unlike Richard Dawkins later, of it's not the individual level where people evolve, they should focus on group selection. And so he was playing with the idea of like, maybe groups get smarter over time, and the group ends up influencing those individuals. There's something magical that happens at different levels of analysis. And even today, we're grappling with the idea of like, maybe we were limited in our evolutionary thinking of just thinking at the individual level. And so when those dissenters are off base, left of center, offer interesting but like provocative, strange ideas, that half-baked idea could be the starting blocks for someone else's creative breakthrough. And that's the thing I want people to hold on to, is don't be silent because your idea isn't developed yet, and wait the 20 years to be Darwin. Be more of a bulldog. Have the half-baked ideas like Alfred Russel Wallace, throw them out there, and then you never know what other people, how they'll tinker with it, modify it, and with their unique repository of what they've been reading, what they've been thinking about, who they've been conversing with, that interesting social combination might be just the thing that your idea needs to be. So as opposed to being a useless extra, ends up being like, something that actually is an innovative process that can be helpful for an individual or society.
Yeah, so these rebels, of course, again, back to this survivorship bias, Kahneman studied the overconfidence bias, where, of course, entrepreneurs, they're high risk takers. They're very overconfident, and that's good because they have a high chance of failure, and they need to be able to push through all the obstacles that most of us would cave into early on. And then, of course, we read about the successful ones like Steve Jobs. But in fact, most entrepreneurial efforts probably are not good ideas. They probably should fail. The market just doesn't want them for whatever reason. And so a venture capitalist who's actually putting money on the line, the skin in the game, they need to make the decision, is this guy the next Jobs? And even though he comes off, super overconfident, they're all overconfident. How do I know which is the right rebel to back and follow, or cut and get our losses now, and not further back? That seems to be a hard problem.
So I would shine the spotlight not on people that are walking in Shark Tank and actually offering their ideas, but shine the spotlight on who are the people that get like the Lufthansa first class chairs that are staring at the person who's presenting their idea. So one of the problems of Shark Tank and venture capitalists is they're just hanging out with a bunch of people that think like them, look like them, and have the same Silicon Valley background. I mean, so it was only when who was the woman that discovered the company Spanx and started it? Sarah Lively, I think. Okay, so she couldn't get a venture capitalist to back her. She did what most entrepreneurs did and had all of her family kind of cough up like a bunch of mortgages and money. And then she basically created like a more diverse group of venture capitalists, which would have people that were not in industry, and larger range of demographics that happen there, and they've done extremely well, like their venture capitalist companies, because they have more perspectives they're bringing to the table. And it reminds me of, when you had the NASA explosion in '84, and you have, as opposed to having a bunch of NASA engineers at the table, it's like, listen, let's just go pluck Richard Feynman and go ask him what he thinks, because he's a smart bloke. Right. And then he solves the problem. And we have a society right now where if you bring in an outsider who's just a smart, wise character, we get not skeptical, we get cynical about it. And I think we have to think about Richard Feynman with the NASA explosion, of figuring out like here are the O-rings of the reason why you had the explosion. Is who are we bringing in that's the Richard Feynman that's going to be the outsider that maybe gives us another piece of the puzzle or another key that unlocks the answer to what we're looking for. And I think that's where the dissenter doesn't have to be, their idea doesn't have to be functional. Their motivation has to be pro-social. Their motivation has to be epistemic, where they're interested in knowledge, they're interested in accumulating knowledge, and they're interested in offering knowledge, and they're interested in actually improving their prediction models to actually get better. So when you add epistemic motivation and you add pro-social motivation, and you have this authenticity in terms of, I'm not doing this to be liked. I'm not doing this for my group to love me and anoint me as the next leader. I'm doing this because I can't imagine not writing this book. I couldn't imagine not spending time on this idea. And that authenticity is what's often the missing element why you have a non-principled dissenter in the mix.
Seems like the rub here is to find the balance between being in the box, so you know what's been tried already and has failed, and then you want to break out of the box, but you have to know something about what's in that box. Here I'm thinking of, yesterday I recorded a podcast episode with Sabine Hassenfelder, who's a quantum physicist. She has a new book out called Existential Physics. Anyway, she's great. And so I got, I started telling her about all the letters I get of people that have theories of everything. Like Einstein was wrong, and Newton was wrong, and Stephen Hawking was wrong, and Feynman was wrong, and I've got this theory I've worked out, right, and so forth. And of course, she gets these, 10 times more than I get them. And it's like, how do you know that guy's not the next Einstein? They all think they're the next Einstein. And anyway, sure enough, like an hour after we finished the recording, I got another one of these from a South Korean taxi driver. And this thing went on and on for like 50 pages. And it was a massive file with these 4-color high-res photographs of clocks and I don't know what. And it was, like a 30 megabyte. I couldn't even email it to her. It was so big. And, basically saying, I figured it out. And so I wrote him back and said, this is not even the first one I've gotten this week. And I've had probably 1,000 of these in the last decade. I recommend you, try a physics journal and one specific thing, not like the theory of the universe. Here it is, everything. Just pick one little problem, right? And of course, no, you don't get it, and so on. So how do you know who the next Einstein is, the next Darwin, the next Feynman, versus the 10,000 others that are just nobodies, because they don't have any training. They don't even know what's been done, right? So you have to, there's some balance in there.
I mean, this is Dean Simonton's model of creativity, where, the funnel model is the greatest prediction they're going to have a successful creative idea is just the number of ideas. And what we do is we truncate the supply of ideas early, one, by avoiding all of the weirdos and preventing them from being in our social group. We exclude them and ostracize them. And then we have our like-minded people who think the same and look the same. We make sure that that's kind of so we have a greater non-permeable boundary between us and the other groups. So we have group solidarity, but we have a reduction in creative thinking and divergent thinking that happens there. So we choose convergent thinking. And so we're doing so many things at a social level that reduces the probability of creative achievements and innovation. And yet we are a society that's constantly valuing these things that we are doing exactly the opposite. The greatest gift for creativity is increase the breadth and depth of alternative possibilities. And for that to happen, the conversation can't come to premature closure. And all these things we've been talking about today, if we talk about trans issues, if we talk about race, if we talk about sex, if we talk about the economics of having too many administrators as bloat at the university, and that's why tuition is so high, or all of these issues. People come to a decision too rapidly with too few options, too few adversaries, and they are having, as a result, suboptimal decision making and suboptimal results and outcomes.
Hmm. All right, Todd, we've been going just up on 2 hours now. So kind of give us the take-home message here. If make it a PSA, if I'm a department head at some company or in a university or a sports team, whatever, and I want to bring in a rebel, a insubordinate rebel to kind of mix things up, what am I looking for? Just kind of generically.
Yeah, I mean, well, the greatest protection against conformity mistakes, which every group has, is having a divergent viewpoint in the room. And so, it doesn't matter what team or what your group does, you're going to make conformity mistakes because we like to be liked. And if someone says they don't like to be liked, then they want to be liked even more than the other people that happens there. And one of the most important elements is not that we want to increase the amount of dissenters in a group, but we have to create a culture where we permit and embrace it when it happens. And everybody says they're into it until they're in a situation where someone disagrees with something that they care about. And that's when the rubber hits the road. And it's the same thing that Greg Lukianoff will talk about free speech. If you are a fan of an organization that supports free speech and they have not supported a viewpoint that you disagree with, that's not a good free speech organization. And the same thing for trying to be a creative, innovative, productive group. If you have people in your room that only have views that you agree with and nod your head to, you're not getting the unique information in the room, and you don't have unique people in the room, and you, I know, are a suboptimal performing group.
Is it good if the boss maybe leaves the room? There's that scene in the Cuban Missile Crisis where Bobby Kennedy tells Jack, we got the heads of all the departments. It's better if you're not in here because they won't speak their minds otherwise.
So not only does the leader have to speak last, and I think that, because that's said like it's almost a cliche at this point. But I actually believe the socially attractive people have to speak last. So you, Michael Shermer, right? I mean, listen, I've been reading your book since I was a teenager, and so if I'm in a room with you, and we were at that Heterodox conference several years ago before COVID, you did a great job. I was moderating a panel, and you were the last person to speak at the Q&A, and it wasn't, and I thought to myself, I'm like, that's good because I bet you because you have more experience and wisdom in these areas of heterodox thinking. But you let younger people speak first, early career thinkers speak first, and then later you weren't trying to be the godhead who kind of summates everything together, like your South Korean friend with the clocks. You were just like, listen, I'll let everyone else speak. No one else will say anything. I guess I'll raise my hand and say something too. We need the socially attractive people that people want to win their favor to not be speaking first. And a good leader has to give that person the compliment of saying, listen, when you talk, everyone puts down their phones, they sit there attentive, they lean forward. So because of that you are so good at galvanizing other people, I need you to shut up. I need you to not say anything. And then you can email me your thoughts later. And that's going to make a group stronger and wiser.
Are there some cues you could give to the crowd, like in a classroom, for example? I'm the worst at leading discussions. I'll just ask some question and they're so quiet. Again, my students are freshmen. They're just right out of high school. Maybe they're just quiet because they're intimidated. I don't know what. But, I want them to, this is a seminar, right? So come on. But I don't know what to do to get them to speak up. I mean, what are some tips? Like, what's your position on abortion? You can't possibly not have an opinion.
I'm gonna tell you what. So I had my first class of the science of well-being. This will be I think my 23rd year. This is the first thing I'm gonna do. I'm gonna write on the board correlation equals 0.09 on the board, and people are gonna walk in. I'll probably write the word correlation over the R because they might not know what it is, and then I'm gonna sit there, and then I'm gonna say, listen, this is the correlation between. You know the study, the Rin et al. Study. This is the correlation between being the survivor of childhood sexual abuse, and then having mental health symptoms in college. What are your thoughts about this hypothesis? True, makes sense. What hypothesis do you have of why this correlation is 0.09? And what I'm not going to do is say whether it's small or large, or it links up with how I think, or it's against how I think. I'm not going to go into the controversies yet. And then it's just I'm gonna sit back and just shut up. And then conversation always takes place, and then I talk about the political controversy behind that study. And it sets up the whole class of, listen, politics and science are not separate. And then that sets up the conversation of, we need to figure out the culture of how we're going to argue in this classroom, and we're going to talk about the principles of productive conflict, and I set up the culture of the class. But it all starts with just that correlation, and nobody's quiet once I put that correlation on the board.
Interesting. So they don't know 0.09. They don't know what that means in this class.
I don't know. I mean, that's the other thing, right? What's cool about doing that is I have no idea what's going to happen. It could go horribly, horribly wrong, and it could lead down a conversation like you're saying. I could be talking about statistics. I could be talking about the science of what we know about being abused as a child. I could be talking about, talking about controversial issues and why it is a necessity for scientists to approach topics that are going to cause social friction, going to cause anxiety, and could lead us to be, rejected and socially persecuted. And we'll talk. Maybe that's where we go. I have no idea. And the part of it is, the beauty of the college classroom is it could go anywhere, because there's no test we have to take at the end of the semester. But it's going to be emblematic of, if it goes well, then I use that as an example. Like, listen, this is exactly how I want this whole semester to be. I am not going to lead all these conversations. I want you to, and if they don't speak, then I could talk about, listen, we just talked about being sexually abused as a kid has almost no correlation with your mental health in college, and you guys said nothing. We will not have fun. This will not be a functional class. This will be such a freaking boring class if we can't talk about this. And like you said, I know everyone has opinions about this, because statistically, everyone in this room has either experienced it or knows someone who has. And so we need to figure out, so you tell me, what can I do so we can have much more discourse in this room, because it'll keep a lot of us awake more of the time.
Interesting. Yeah, even asking that would be helpful. I also have a hard time with silence, right? So group leaders ask a question and then nothing is said. It's really hard to just sit there and do nothing.
Oh, so I'm the same way as a New Yorker. We talk fast, we talk a lot. I have phrases. I'm like, you know what? I'm like, listen, I have titanium coated skin. I don't care about being rejected. I'm just a bit too old, so I can sit here and outweigh all of you. But until someone says something controversial, I'm just gonna sit right here in a plank position on the floor, and you guys just sit there quietly, until we'll wait each other out. And there's always somebody like, all right, listen, Todd, just please, the silence is too painful. All right, I'm gonna throw something into the ring.
That's really funny. All right, Todd, that was great. I loved your book, and I know you're always researching new things. What's next on your research agenda and writing projects?
I'm getting back into purpose in life. I think people have misunderstood just the power of not just how to detect a purpose, but actually how to commit to a purpose. And I'm really interested in purpose transitions. So just as I think COVID's had a big impact on me. So I have less of an interest in creating psychological experiments now, and I'm much more interested in synthesizing decades and decades of research together. And as we have this very interesting social experiment where people are living much longer than they're supposed to. I mean, you're the evolutionary psychology expert. We're not supposed to live to 100 and still be functional, where we're walking around and meeting new people. So knowing that changing your purpose at the age of 60 and 70 is no longer weird. It's, you have potentially 30 years left. And so I'm really interested in how purpose and aging intersect, and want to kind of explore this in more depth.
Yeah, that's a great subject. I was just looking up that paper I wrote about in Scientific American by Clay Routledge on this is sort of the relationship between belief in extraterrestrial intelligences and religiosity, and that people that have a high need of purpose and spirituality, but they're not traditionally religious, are more likely to believe that ETIs are out there and are visiting us or whatever. It's an interesting thing, but he's been doing a lot of research on purpose. I think that is a really super important topic for psychological scientists, particularly since all us baby boomers are about to hit the wall. So we're starting to reflect on, what does it all mean, right? I'm about to turn 68, so I have been giving more thought to that. I find myself more, I guess, reflective on, further back in my life or going forward, or putting it more into perspective. Nostalgia, right? That's what you guys call it. It's an actual area of study, right?
Yeah.
Study nostalgia. It's a super interesting subject. Sometimes I feel guilty doing it, like, Shermer, come on, it doesn't really matter what happened 30 years ago. Just, get down and write your next article, but sometimes it feels like, but that's okay. It should be all right to kind of reflect on the bigger meaning of it all.
I mean, just like we talked about the gay liberation rights movement of how it can help social activists today, your fights against creationists and intelligent design in the 80s and the 90s is really important. There's really good articles for you to be writing in terms of like, what could we learn about how that was handled well and what you would do differently. And those are the lessons for whatever the intellectual debates are going to be in the 2030s that are going to come next.
Yeah. Yeah, by the way, although it's true everything you said about the longevity, it does appear to be an upper ceiling of about 120, and most people are not going to get much past 100. Even like kids born today are more likely to make it to 100 than you and I are. But at some point, the curve, it's an asymptotic curve, right? Unless something big
can only
happens,
shrink so much.
Telomeres or some genetic re-engineering of cells. I think, just give me an extra year, because people say, wouldn't you like to live another 500 years? Like, I don't really know. Just give me an extra year when the end is coming, or an extra decade. I'll take that. But in the kind of cryonic circle or the transhumanist circle that I travel in sometimes, it's like, we're going to live 1,000 years. The first person to live 1,000 is already born. It's like, please, And just one.
I need to come to these parties. These parties sound awesome.
Oh, they're too fun. No, it's great. And it's like, listen, just solve Alzheimer's, okay? Just that one thing. You'll win the Nobel Prize. Come on, don't worry about 1,000 years. Anyway, all right, Todd. I gotta run. Thanks so much for coming on the show. Thanks for your work. Love the book. Love your work. Super important. Stay in touch.
Totally mutual. Thanks, Michael.
Okay.